Hello and welcome to TEDcast, the show that explores the topics that are on leaders' minds. My name's Lee Hart-Hunt and I'm the TED lead at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals. And today I'm going to be summarising some of the conversations that were in our recent TED Team Leader Workshop around using TED when time is tight. This workshop was set up because we know one of the key barriers to TED can be the stretch on your team's time. We know that in different professional settings, it can be difficult to create time for engagement. Together with team leaders from Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, we explored how the TED cycle can be adapted to meet the needs of different teams in different professional settings. We kicked off our workshop by holding a roundtable discussion which explored the time challenges which can make it difficult to work on engagement when a team is busy. The first theme that came up indicated how shift patterns made it difficult for certain teams to get everyone together at the same time. An important part of the TED process is in bringing people together so that you can hear everyone's views and create a shared way forward. But sometimes different shift patterns may be from teams that work night shifts as well as day shifts or have different rotas to work can make it difficult for teams to come together as one team. The second challenge which team leaders highlighted was how that teams in patient or customer facing settings see responsiveness as a barrier to their engagement work. Many teams in a frontline, in patient or customer facing roles need to be responsive to their external stakeholders. So this restricts their ability to be able to take time away from the work area or to all come together as a team. Sometimes it can be really difficult or even impossible to bring everyone together to engage in a meaningful TED discussion. Another challenge which our team leaders identified was in workload volume. One of the biggest pressures that can lead to difficulties when engaging with TED is that sheer volume of workload that your team is working on. Teams and team leaders were concerned about dropping behind on their workload if they created time outside the workplace or away from their significant pressures. Another challenge which many teams see is in shifting priorities and dynamic working practices. In the modern world, many teams work in this dynamic type of way, and especially when you're in a responsive type of service, it can be difficult to plan ahead because you don't know what's going to be happening from one day to the next. Sometimes the best laid plans can go awry, and it can be hard to regain that momentum once your initial plans have become derailed. And the final factor which some team leaders raised was that their teams were dispersed. And for teams that perhaps work across multiple different sites, maybe you're based out in communities or work in lone working settings at times, they may find it difficult to bring everybody together. Sometimes this interlinks with those concerns around shift patterns, but they make it difficult for that team to even see themselves as a team sometimes. Whilst these factors all represent valid reasons why engagement work can be a challenge, we recognised in the group the importance that engagement has on creating inclusive and supportive team environments. And the evidence which sits behind TED shows that engaged teams can experience improved staff retention, reduced sickness absence, happier team members, and more resilient teams. So from the team leaders I spoke with, there was a real recognition that they want to work on their team engagement. They want to implement things like TED, but sometimes these external challenges or challenges in the type of work they do make it really difficult to either make engagement a priority or to create the space to have a useful and meaningful engagement discussion. So how can we make TED work against a challenging backdrop of factors? This is what we explored throughout the session. Here we see the core points of the TED engagement cycle. Down the right-hand side, we can see the steps that team leaders take when setting up their TED survey ready for their team. These are some of the quicker elements in TED because you have control of that as a team leader. You can do it yourself in a time frame that works for you. Some team leaders might do all of this in one sitting. Others may do this over the course of a week or two while they're talking with their team around TED and their intentions for using the engagement approach. On the left-hand side of the cycle, we see some of the slower elements of the TED process. Often, the barriers that we discussed on the previous slide make it difficult to hold a feedback session with your team. Sometimes this is because of those time constraints. Sometimes it might be because there's something tricky in your TED feedback and you're looking for the perfect time to deliver that feedback or that space to be able to explore something which might be quite complex. Sometimes it may be that you're waiting for support, and until you get that, you're reluctant to proceed in case things go wrong. When you think about setting an action plan, as a team leader, you can summarize the points that have come out of your TED report and the discussion, but actually putting it into action and making them a reality is the part which takes the longest time. And often this will be something which happens in the weeks and months following your TED survey. This process illustrates how important the feedback loop is. But if this loop is broken in any section, it can actually undermine the success of your engagement work. So for instance, if you sent out your survey and then left it 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6 months before feeding that back to the team, things may have changed since you set that out initial survey, and the team may feel that their feedback hasn't been listened to. The team may feel that nothing has changed following their feedback, and may even feel that nothing will ever change and that there's no point in giving feedback at all. This illustrates just how important it is to get this feedback loop right, but also how important it is to keep momentum with your feedback practice. If this is the first time you've used TED and you've found that your feedback session wasn't timely enough, or that you've struggled to set your plans into action, what you can do is use this as a discussion point when you do your next follow-up TED. The TED process is intended to be a continuous improvement practice. And the reason for that is that we know we can't solve all of a team's problems just through one survey or one discussion. The intention is that you'll get incrementally better each time you revisit TED. These incremental improvements can apply to the TED process itself, and by keeping momentum, you can ensure you create space to reflect on the success of your previous TED cycle, discuss what perhaps went wrong, and how you can improve the next time you go through it. In your team discussion, you might be discussing if your team was maybe too ambitious with your previous action plans, or if there were external factors which meant your action plans couldn't be put into practice. It's okay if you don't achieve all the actions you set out to do. The core point of the TED cycle and the continuous improvement approach is that you learn from what's worked, but also what hasn't worked, and make those incremental improvements as you go forward with your team. The next part of our workshop explored what makes the TED process successful. Because if we're thinking about stripping back some of these elements or about adapting it in any way to suit the needs of your team, it's important to still get the fundamentals of the continuous improvement process right. At the core of TED, what we want to create is a feedback culture in our teams. We're giving feedback in a safe way, exploring the different views of our team together can help create a culture where colleagues feel our views are listened to, but also where each colleague in our team appreciates those different views across the team. With TED, we want to instigate constructive conversations around the things that are most important to our team. We recognise that every team is different and each team will have different challenges, different strengths, different ways of doing things, as well as working in different professional settings, at different levels, in different organisations. So with TED, we want your team to decide what those conversations should be about and what's most important to you and your team. Through the continuous improvement cycle, we want to create a shared commitment to positive change. And this momentum that I've talked about intends to, over time, help the team improve and learn from what they've gone through together. I've spoken with team leaders in the past who've perhaps been disappointed that their first experience with TED hasn't created that shared commitment instantly. I remind them that the intention with TED is that this commitment will grow over time. And if you find that commitment isn't there after your initial TED, it's okay. By following through with the process, each time you revisit the TED cycle, you help to create that bit more confidence and commitment throughout your team, because you create new examples of how the process is working, but also create that space to reflect on what didn't work and how you're going to learn together. Ultimately, TED is about creating this continuous improvement culture, because if we encourage the practice of regular reflection, refocus, and targeted action towards the things that matter most to you and your team, you can learn together, you can create confidence, and ensure that everyone feels that you're headed in the right direction. So how can we adapt the TED cycle without compromising the core elements that make it successful? The next part of our workshop looked at first the typical ways in which teams use TED feedback before exploring some alternatives that could work for teams in different settings. Here we see a typical feedback session that a team leader may run to explore the team's TED results. When you first train as a TED team leader, we recommend this approach as the best practice to work with your team. We've tried to keep this as simple and as accessible as possible so that many teams can adopt this approach in a way which is useful for team leaders who are maybe new to the process. However, the factors that we've already explored in this session show how this process can be difficult in some team settings, whether it's because of your different work patterns, competing pressures, external influences, or unforeseen circumstances. There might be occasions when bringing the whole team together for a session like this might not be the best way to keep momentum with TED. When delivering your TED feedback, the gold standard approach is for everybody to meet in person. And wherever possible, we'd encourage you to strive for this outcome. Ideally, you should conduct this outside of the work area where you're free from distractions. You'd also give everybody the opportunity to speak. And it would be led by you, the team leader. The benefits of this gold standard approach are that the team have a chance to listen to everyone's different view, to give them that opportunity to interpret those different perspectives and to interpret the TED results and share their ideas together. This approach also ensures that the team see you as the team leader as valuing their feedback and wanting to take on board their views on the best next steps on your way forward. Whilst we'd always encourage this gold standard approach, What we don't want to do is insist that this is the only way that you can engage with TED. In my experience of working with different teams, I've seen some really innovative alternative approaches that work in different team settings. Some teams have delivered their feedback remotely. Some have conducted it inside the work area, perhaps as part of an existing team meeting. And sometimes you might conduct feedback asynchronously, where you'll be sharing your TED feedback in an initial session, and then at future sessions, asking for the thoughts and views of your team members. Occasionally, if a team has significant challenges, you can also be supported by a TED practitioner to make that feedback process work. Whilst all these alternative approaches aren't the gold standard, they are still viable approaches for working with feedback from your team and creating that momentum towards that continuous improvement culture and engagement. Here you see some of the pros and cons of alternative feedback approaches. Firstly, we have remote delivery. This can work really well for teams who work in a remote way already, or if your team is dispersed across multiple sites, where the key challenge is bringing everybody together at the same time. Remote technology can help you connect with your team and help make feedback work when perhaps diary commitments make it difficult to get together. An advantage of remote delivery with your TED feedback can be the option to use collaborative technologies. Things like Google Jamboard or Mentimeter, other interactive whiteboards or interactive polls can help add richness to your team conversation. It's important to acknowledge, however, that there are drawbacks to this approach. If you're in a team where not everyone is confident with the remote technology, this approach could be more of a barrier to constructive conversation. It might make it difficult for everyone to contribute to the discussion. Sometimes, particularly for larger teams, a remote feedback session can be difficult. Often when many people are on a call, some team members may be reluctant to get involved in the conversation. So the use of those interactive elements, such as whiteboards or word storms, polls, can help everybody get involved and be engaged with the session. Our second option here in the table is to suggest how teams might use multiple feedback sessions. The benefit of this is that it helps you keep the main service of your team running. If you're a team that can't bring everyone away from the workplace at the same time, you may want to run multiple feedback opportunities. This can be useful for large teams. If you're a team of 20 or more team members, it could be really difficult to find a suitable venue or forum for everybody to be there in the same place at the same time. So running 2, 3, perhaps even 4 or 5 feedback sessions allows everybody to engage with your TED results and to put across their views as to what your next steps as a team should be. The drawbacks of multiple feedback sessions are that it can take longer to do. It might take you several feedback sessions over a number of weeks before you've heard everybody's voice. Another drawback is that not everybody is in the room when people are sharing their interpretation of the results and their ideas for the next steps. Whilst this is not ideal, it can still be a useful approach and still helps to keep that momentum with your team's engagement work. The final option in this table is this concept of asynchronous feedback. By asynchronous, I mean that TED feedback is delivered in incremental steps, which can help gather that momentum for the team. It helps your team feel that something is happening with your feedback and gives the team members opportunity to think of ideas before committing them to your action plan. I've seen examples in the past where teams have shared TED and their team's feedback at an initial briefing, and then ask for suggestions through a team suggestion board or a suggestion box where team members submit their ideas. The challenges with this approach is, again, that everybody doesn't necessarily hear the views of everyone else within the team. And it can make it more difficult to create this sense of shared commitment. But again, it's still a viable option for keeping that momentum. I often suggest to teams that are really stretched to use asynchronous feedback approach as an initial way of understanding and acknowledging feedback. It's important to be clear in this approach with the team so that you don't raise expectations too highly. It's also important to look ahead to the future for times maybe later on in the year when your team might be less stretched and can have a more constructive TED conversation. The asynchronous approach is one way that you can keep momentum with your team and helps you get that sense check of where your team is at the moment and what the best things are for your team to work on. In our workshop, we then looked at some examples of how different teams have used TED. This slide shows an example of how some teams look at different elements of the TED survey during different team briefs. I've worked with many teams in clinical settings who often don't have large team meetings with time to explore their full TED results. Often teams might only have 15 or 20 minutes a day when they can all get together and share ideas and views. This example shows how a team might on each day of the week look at 2 different TED themes. So they're looking at a snapshot of their TED results before moving on to the next section of results on the following day. In this example, we see for 4 days of a week, a team will spend exploring the different question themes within TED. And then on Friday, they will summarize what they've learned together and set their plan into action. Another option for teams might be to create a team TED poster. The important things to highlight in this are the key positives from your TED report around what makes us great and how you intend to recognize it, but also the key areas for improvement and ideas for how you can help. An example of this is seen here. This team identified that team purpose was their highest scoring TED theme. Next to the team purpose, it shows examples from the TED comments which suggested how the team can recognize success. For this team, the way they wanted to improve was in team communication. They had the lowest TED score out of any of the TED themes in this area. Next to that, they shared what they could do to help and some of the ideas that came across in TED comments or through the suggestions that their team had put forward. Sometimes it can also be useful to summarize broader points within the TED survey. This helps team members quickly pick out the key factors that have been highlighted by TED and helps you quickly get to discussing your key strengths as a team, which you want to build on, but also your key areas for improvement, which you'd like to work on and like to see improvements when you next come to visit TED. Sometimes it helps to have a clear action plan. And in this example, this team set out 4 specific phases for how they would set about reviewing their TED results, when they would put their actions into place, and then when and how they would reflect on those actions together. This example is from a real team that used this and set out some clear steps which help the team see that momentum in practice. Thank you for watching this episode of TEDcast. I hope they've found this session useful and can take some of the practical steps forward for use with your team. Some of the best feedback we get in the TED team is from these TED workshops, where you team leaders come and make suggestions on how we can improve the TED process, how we can support you better, and where we can learn from how other teams are using TED in practice. If you'd like to attend one of our upcoming TED events, in January 2024, we'll be running a session focused around planning for the year ahead with TED. And in February and March, we'll be running in-person sessions at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals to explore how teams have approached difficult feedback in the past, where you'll be able to share examples from your own team, get advice from the experts, but also listen to different teams and how they've approached feedback in different ways with success.